The Chamonix Valley stretched endlessly beneath a crystalline blue sky on that September morning, the kind of day that makes alpinists forget why they fear mountains at all. Thomas Mercier stood at the base of the trail leading toward Mont Blanc's outer peaks, breathing in the thin alpine air that carried the sharp scent of pine and stone. He was 53 years old, a structural engineer from Lyon with 15 years of hiking experience across Europe. Behind him, his daughter Sophie, 28, adjusted the straps on her backpack. She was a physician from Geneva, visiting her father for the first time in 2 years. The distance between them had grown over time, not just geographically but emotionally. This hike was supposed to change that. The trail was marked clearly with red and white blazes painted on the rocks. Thomas had studied the route obsessively for weeks, printed maps, checked weather forecasts, and invested in new Gore-Tex boots specifically for this journey. The Weather Service had promised clear skies until evening. Their plan was simple: climb steadily through the morning, reach the Guter hut by early afternoon, rest there for an hour or two, and descend before darkness fell. It was a moderate hike for experienced walkers. They had been told repeatedly by guides at the village. Sophie moved with practiced precision, her medical training evident in the methodical way she adjusted her pace and monitored her breathing. Thomas watched her from behind, noticing the determined set of her shoulders. She had agreed to the hike after weeks of his gentle requests. Their phone calls had become strained conversations filled with silence. Her mother, his ex-wife, had remarried 3 years ago. Sophie had chosen to spend holidays with that new family unit instead of with him. This trip felt like a last attempt, though neither of them said it aloud. The first 2 hours passed without incident. The path wound upward through dense forest where sunlight filtered in golden threads through the canopy. They spoke in fragments. Sophie asked about his job. He asked about her hospital work. The conversation was careful, like two people learning how to talk again after a long absence. Around noon, they emerged from the forest into the alpine meadows where the view suddenly expanded to impossible distances. Peaks upon peaks stretched toward the horizon, and the valley below seemed to belong to another world entirely. Thomas consulted his watch and checked his GPS device. They were making good time. Sophie sat on a moss-covered rock and pulled out her water bottle, drinking deeply. Her face was flushed from exertion, but her breathing was steady. Thomas sat beside her, and for several minutes, they simply looked out across the landscape without speaking. It was one of the few comfortable silences they had shared in years. As they prepared to resume hiking, Thomas noticed clouds beginning to gather on the western horizon. He had been watching weather patterns for days, and according to every forecast, clear skies should continue until evening. He made a mental note but said nothing. There was no reason to alarm Sophie. Mountain weather changed constantly. The clouds were still far away. The trail began to steepen noticeably as they climbed higher. The vegetation became more sparse: low shrubs, hardy grasses, and increasingly exposed stone. They were entering the transition zone where the Alps moved from beautiful to serious. The air temperature had dropped considerably, and Sophie pulled on an additional layer from her pack. The path here was narrower, with loose scree on both sides. Thomas had researched this section extensively. He knew that scrambling over loose rock required careful footwork and balance. Sophie asked if they should turn back. The question carried weight beyond its surface meaning. Thomas heard in it a deeper uncertainty, not just about the hike, but about whether this reconnection was working, whether their effort to rebuild was worthwhile. He told her they were only 90 minutes from the hut, that they had plenty of time before nightfall, that the clouds on the horizon were nothing to worry about. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had hiked these mountains before, someone who believed his experience was enough to mitigate risk. They pressed onward. The path became increasingly technical. They needed to use their hands in places, pulling themselves up over rocky sections. Sophie moved carefully, demonstrating the physical competence her medical career required. Thomas felt a surge of something like pride watching her navigate the terrain with such methodical care. Around 2 o'clock, The wind picked up noticeably. The clouds that had been distant now seemed much closer, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Thomas checked his watch again. They were still nearly an hour from the hut. He suggested they increase their pace slightly. Sophie agreed, without question. The trail at this elevation followed a ridge line with significant exposure on both sides. To the left, a steep slope descended into mist and shadow. To the right, the mountain rose upward at an even steeper angle. The path itself was only about 4 feet wide, composed of loose, shattered rock that moved beneath their boots. This was the section that required the most concentration. Thomas had reviewed photographs and topographic maps of this exact stretch. He knew where the dangerous sections were. Sophie was perhaps 10 meters ahead of him when the weather changed with startling abruptness. The clouds that had been creeping across the landscape suddenly enveloped them completely. Visibility dropped from miles to perhaps 30 meters in less than a minute. The temperature plummeted further, and the wind intensified dramatically. Thomas called out to Sophie to stop and wait for him. He could see her figure through the mist, but not the terrain around her with any clarity. He moved toward her carefully, placing each foot with deliberate precision. The rocks here were notoriously loose, a combination of shattered slate and loose scree that shifted beneath any weight. The guidebook had mentioned this section specifically. Extreme care required, loose terrain, not suitable for inexperienced or hurried walkers. Thomas had convinced himself that 15 years of experience and 2 detailed guidebooks made him sufficiently prepared. He had not hired a guide. He had not checked with the local ranger office that morning. He had not paid attention to the small warning that several hikers had mentioned the previous day at the village cafe, that autumn snow had fallen higher up, and that the loose rock was particularly unstable this year after the unusual summer freeze. Sophie turned around when he reached her. Even through the mist, he could see the concern in her eyes. She asked if they should descend immediately. Thomas told her that the hut was closer, then returning to the safe ground below. He explained that mountain weather was unpredictable, that mist would likely pass. He made a decision to continue based partly on experience, partly on pride, and partly on the unconscious need to prove to his daughter that he was capable, that he knew what he was doing, that she could trust him. They moved forward together now, with Thomas leading. The visibility was so limited that he could barely see his own feet. He placed each step with what he believed was extreme care, testing each stone before transferring his full weight to it. Sophie followed closely behind, her breathing audible even over the wind. Thomas was perhaps 15 meters past Sophie when the mountain spoke in a language older than words. A section of the trail, perhaps 8 feet long, the exact section they were crossing, had been destabilized by the combination of summer freeze-thaw cycles and autumn rains. The rocks here had been slowly loosening for months. The added weight of 2 hikers in quick succession, combined with the vibration from their boots, was enough to trigger what geologists would later call a localized failure event. The rocks beneath Thomas shifted, dropped, and then began to slide. For a fraction of a second, he experienced the disorientation of his feet suddenly being lower than expected. His body moved with reflexive quickness to adjust, a survival mechanism developed over millions of years of human evolution. But the slope was steep, and the rocks were still moving, and his right foot found nothing solid beneath it. Sophie watched her father stumble. She saw him reach sideways, desperately trying to grab the rocky outcrops to his right, but they too were part of the unstable section. The sound he made, not quite a scream, more a sharp exhalation of surprise, was immediately swallowed by the wind and mist. Thomas fell backward down the steep slope to his left. The experience happened simultaneously in extreme slow motion and terrifying speed. He was aware of each impact, rock against shoulder blade, rock against hip, rock against thigh. He was aware of the world rotating dizzily around him as he tumbled down the loose mountainside. He was aware that he couldn't find any solid surface to grab, that his fingers scraped against moving rocks and found nothing to hold, that the slope seemed to extend downward into infinite darkness. The mist obscured everything. Sophie screamed his name, but her voice seemed distant, reaching her father from another world. She dropped to her knees at the edge of the unstable section, afraid to follow, aware that the rocks that had fallen beneath her father might do the same to her. Thomas tumbled for perhaps 40 meters, a distance that contained enough drops and impacts to alter the trajectory of 2 lives forever. When his body finally came to rest against a larger boulder that had not moved, he lay still in the mist, invisible to his daughter. Sophie called his name, repeatedly. There was no answer. She called it again, her voice growing increasingly desperate. She removed her backpack, extracted her emergency whistle, and blew 3 sharp blasts into the wind and mist, the Alpine distress signal, but the wind simply carried the sound away into the mountains' indifference. After perhaps 2 minutes that felt like decades, Sophie heard a response. Not a clear voice, but a sound. Muffled, pained, inarticulate. It came from somewhere down the slope below where she stood. She understood immediately that her father was injured, unable to respond properly, unable to climb back up toward her. Sophie made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She removed her sturdy boots and pulled on her more flexible hiking shoes, understanding that her medical training made her the only possible source of help. She carefully, methodically, tested each stone before putting her weight on it. She moved slowly down the slope, calling her father's name with each step, following the muffled sounds of his breathing. She found him 10 minutes later, though it felt like hours. Her father was conscious, but only barely. His right arm was bent at an angle that no human arm should bend. His chest rose and fell irregularly, and his breathing made a wet, concerning sound. When he saw his daughter, he tried to smile, though his face was streaked with blood from a gash on his forehead. Sophie's medical training took over completely. She assessed, inventoried, evaluated. His right arm was definitely broken, probably in multiple places. His breathing suggested at least 1 rib fracture, possibly more, possibly internal damage. His left leg was badly lacerated and swollen. He had a significant head wound that had stopped bleeding somewhat, but could mask more serious internal injury. They were on a mountainside, in mist, in temperatures dropping toward freezing, with no clear way to summon help quickly. Sophie used her emergency phone to call the rescue service. The connection was weak but functional. She provided their coordinates using her GPS device and described her father's injuries with clinical precision, her voice steady despite the terror underneath. The dispatcher told her that rescue would be dispatched, but that weather conditions were severe and arrival might take several hours. She should do her best to keep her father warm, monitor his breathing, and prevent him from moving. Sophie did what she had been trained to do. She used her own jacket as additional covering. She positioned him carefully, aware that moving him further could cause additional injury. She talked to him constantly, keeping him conscious, monitoring his pupils and his responses, checking his pulse at regular intervals. Her father tried to speak. His voice was barely above a whisper, and Sophie had to lean close to his face to hear him. He told her he was sorry. He said it repeatedly, with a kind of desperate intensity that went far beyond apology for the failed hike. She understood that he was apologizing for the years of distance, for the divorce, for missing so much of her life, for being a father who required a mountain accident to draw his daughter close again. Sophie told him not to speak, to conserve his energy, but her father continued anyway. He told her that he had wanted this trip to prove something to her, that he was capable, that he was still the strong father she had once known. He had ignored the warning signs, the unstable weather, the suggestions to turn back, because he could not bear for his daughter to see him as someone who needed to be careful, someone aging, someone losing physical capability. The pride that had kept him on the trail was the same pride that had kept him distant from her for years. The wind picked up again, and the mist grew even thicker. Sophie positioned herself to block the wind from her father's body as much as possible. She talked to him about things they had not discussed in years. Memories of her childhood, hiking trips when she was younger, times when he had been fully present in her life. She talked because silence was intolerable, because talking kept her father conscious, and because she needed him to know that his apology had been received and understood. The rescue operation began as visibility improved slightly, though the mist remained thick. The helicopter pilot had to work with minimal visibility, and the terrain was treacherous. The rescue climbers, experts in alpine rescue, rappelled down the mountainside roped together, their expertise evident in every movement. They assessed Thomas's condition with the same clinical eye that Sophie had brought to bear. Helicopter rescue in mountainous terrain was dangerous. The pilot would hold his position as long as conditions permitted. They loaded Thomas onto a stretcher with careful attention to stabilizing his injuries further. As they began the difficult ascent back up the slope, Thomas looked at his daughter with an expression of fierce intensity. He told her that this had been his responsibility, his mistake, his failure, that she had done everything right, that she had saved his life. She had been there when he needed her most, not because he deserved it, but because of who she was. That would have to be enough. The ascent seemed impossible, but the rescue climbers had spent their entire professional lives doing the impossible in extreme environments. They moved with methodical determination, securing each rope placement, testing each anchor point. After what felt like an eternity, but was actually closer to 20 minutes, they reached the ridge line where the rescue helicopter hovered in the mist. Sophie was secured separately and lifted first, then her father on the stretcher. As the helicopter gained altitude and the mountains fell away beneath them, the pilot calculated that they had perhaps 5 minutes of fuel remaining. The weather was deteriorating further, and if they had remained on the mountainside any longer, the rescue itself would have failed. Thomas was airlifted to the University Hospital in Geneva, the same city where his daughter worked. He underwent surgery for his broken arm, for the multiple rib fractures, and for internal bleeding from a lacerated spleen. The next 72 hours were critical. There were moments when the physicians, some of them colleagues of Sophie, were uncertain he would survive. But the human body is remarkably resilient when given proper medical care and strong motivation to continue living. Sophie spent those 3 days essentially living at the hospital. She consulted with the surgical team. She monitored her father's vital signs more carefully than perhaps any patient she had ever treated. She talked to him during the brief moments when he was conscious. She held his hand during the long hours when medications kept him in chemically induced sleep. On the 4th day, Thomas opened his eyes and looked at his daughter. His voice was weak from the breathing tube that had been required, but his mind was clear. He asked how long he had been unconscious. Sophie told him. He asked what happened. She explained the surgeries, the transfusions, the careful monitoring that had kept him alive. Thomas asked her to tell him everything that had happened on the mountain, every detail, everything she remembered, and Sophie did. She told him about his fall, about finding him, about the rescue, about how many times the outcome could have been different if anything had changed by even a fraction. She told him that if she had not been there, if she had not possessed her medical training, if they had started the hike even 15 minutes later, if the helicopter had encountered different weather, any of these variations would have meant his death. Thomas closed his eyes and cried silently, his shoulders moving slightly beneath the hospital blankets. When he opened his eyes again, he looked at his daughter with an expression of gratitude so profound that it seemed to contain years of regret, remorse, and renewed understanding. The recovery was long. Thomas spent 3 weeks in the hospital before being released to outpatient care. His arm required surgery and months of physical therapy. His rib fractures needed time to heal. But the more serious injury was psychological. He had learned in the most brutal way possible that pride and overconfidence were not the same as competence. That, ignoring warning signs did not make them disappear. That the people we love matter far more than the image we try to maintain. Sophie took leave from her hospital work to care for her father during the critical early weeks of recovery. They spent hours talking in a way they had not talked in years. Sophie told him about her work, her frustrations with hospital administration, her loneliness in Geneva, her regret that they had allowed distance to grow between them. Thomas listened with a father's attention, fully present in a way he had not been for years. When Sophie returned to work, she and Thomas established a schedule of regular video calls. Not the perfunctory 5-minute conversations of before, but genuine connections where they discussed their lives, their thoughts, their feelings. Sophie began visiting her father in Lyon once a month. They started planning hiking trips together, not ambitious mountain climbs, but gentle walks through forests where the terrain was stable and the only goal was to be together. Thomas never returned to serious alpine hiking. His arm never regained full strength, and his confidence in his own judgment had been permanently altered. But he did not view this as a loss. Instead, it was a gain. He had gained his daughter back, not through proving his strength or capability, but through learning vulnerability and accepting help. A year after the accident, Sophie asked her father to tell her the exact moment he decided to ignore the warning signs and continue toward the hut instead of descending when she suggested it. Thomas thought carefully before answering. He told her the truth, that it had not been one moment, but a series of moments, each one a small decision to minimize risk rather than face it honestly. A choice not to hire a guide. A choice to reassure her rather than to be realistic about the weather. A choice to proceed rather than to descend. Each small choice built upon the previous one until they had committed entirely to a path that events had already proven to be dangerous. Sophie asked if he blamed himself. Thomas said that he did, completely and without qualification. He had been the adult, the experienced hiker, the father. The responsibility for what happened belonged entirely to him. But he also said that he had learned something profound from his mistakes, that accepting blame was not the same as accepting defeat. That responsibility could be transformed into changed behavior. That regret could be transformed into commitment to do differently in the future. 2 years after the accident, Sophie married a fellow physician in Geneva. Her father walked her down the aisle, his arm strong again, though not quite the same, his gait steady. He gave a wedding toast where he did not mention mountains or accidents or near-death experiences. Instead, he talked about his daughter's courage, her intelligence, her compassion, the qualities that had kept him alive when everything else had failed. He told the assembled guests that he had nearly lost his greatest treasure, that the mountain had taught him what he should have learned long before, that people matter more than pride, and that the people we love are the only mountains we truly need to climb. Sophie cried during the toast. Her father cried as well. The other guests understood that they were witnessing something beyond a typical father-daughter moment. They were witnessing a relationship healed through loss, transformed through danger, and strengthened through the simple act of being present with one another. In the months that followed, Sophie sometimes returned to that section of the Alps with her husband. She never descended the slope where her father had fallen. She avoided the ridge where pride had nearly killed him. But she did hike the easier sections below, and from those vistas, she would look toward the higher peaks and remember. She remembered her father's initial confidence. She remembered the moment when the world had shifted and she had become the strong one. She remembered finding him in the mist, her medical training transforming into the ultimate act of love, fighting for the life of the man she had been so close to losing. The mountain had taken nothing that could not be rebuilt. It had given instead a perspective that money and therapy and time could never have purchased. It had shown Thomas and Sophie that the only thing worth climbing toward was each other, that safety was not found in experience, or preparation or confidence, but in the willingness to be vulnerable, to admit limitations, and to accept help from those who love us. The Alps stand unchanged, indifferent to the dramas that unfold on their slopes. Other hikers traverse that same ridgeline each season. Some are experienced, some are not. Some turn back when weather changes. Some press forward driven by pride or schedule or the need to prove something. The mountain does not judge. It simply responds to physics and gravity, 2. The choices made by those who venture onto its slopes. Thomas Mercier never fully recaptured the confidence he had felt before the accident, but he discovered something more valuable, the confidence that comes from accepting that we are not as strong as we thought, that our limitations are not weaknesses to hide, but invitations to grow. He discovered that the greatest strength is sometimes simply the ability to say, "I need help," and to receive it from those who love us most. Sophie carried the memory of the rescue with her throughout her career as a physician. She treated mountaineering accidents at the Geneva Hospital. She worked with mountain rescue services to educate hikers about safety. She understood, in a way that few people ever truly do, that the margin between triumph and tragedy on the mountain is razor thin, determined by split-second decisions, by willingness to acknowledge danger, and by the grace of having someone who loves you nearby when everything goes wrong. Years later, when people asked about the accident, Sophie would tell them that it had been the worst and best thing that had ever happened to her. The worst because she had come so close to losing her father. The best because she had finally found him again. Not the ideal father of childhood memory, not the distant father of recent years, but a real human being, flawed and vulnerable and filled with regret, determined to do better. And that real, flawed, vulnerable father was infinitely more valuable than any image he could have maintained. The Alps stand eternal, indifferent to this one story among thousands. But for those who lived it, the mountains had become sacred ground, the place where pride fell away like loose rock, where love became stronger than fear, and where a single wrong step became the beginning of a journey home.